Hi, I'm Tim Madigan, the Director of Irish Studies here at St. John Fisher College. And our guest today on our community forum is Richard Dollinger. He's a judge in the New York State Court of Claims, a Rochester native, and he's also a graduate of McQuaid Jesuit High School, the University of Toronto, a former newspaper reporter, a 10-year member of the New York State Senate, and a lawyer for 32 years. And in addition, he teaches health law to graduate students here at St. John Fisher College. And I might add, his wife Marilyn is the Associate Dean of the Wegman School of Nursing. But in addition, he's a member of the Colonel Patrick O'Rourke Society. And he is involved in a campaign to get O'Rourke a posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroics at the Battle of Gettysburg. And we're going to discuss the reasons for this in today's Our Community Forum. Welcome, Judge Dollinger.
Thank you very much for having me, Tim.
I want to begin by asking you what is known about O'Rourke's origins.
Well, O'Rourke was from Ireland, and what's interesting about him, the family name O'Rourke is a centuries-old, even millennial-old name in Ireland. There was a family that were Irish kings called the O'Rourke. It's spelled differently. I think it's spelled O''R''A''. Gaelic pronounced the same way as O'Rourke. But there are a series of O'Rourke kings that are ruling parts of Ireland in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries after the days of St. Patrick. And what eventually comes about is his family is from County Cavan, which is on the northeast corner in the Republic of Ireland, in the south of Northern Ireland. And his family was there for, I think, a couple of hundred years prior to their coming to the New World in the late 1830s.
Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, I think County Cavan is the sister county to Monroe County.
I think that's correct. And so it's a community in which, it's a county in which there was a huge immigration around the time of the potato famine, which is in the 1840s period, latter 1840s in Ireland. But it's a county that actually, because of emigration to the United States, shrunk in size. In the middle of the 18th century, it had about 350,000 people as a consequence of the famine, as a consequence of the large-scale emigration to the United States. It actually had less than half that population by 1880. So it's one of those communities that, quite frankly, many people in Rochester and in the surrounding community hail from County Cavan.
Well, and that leads to my next question. How did O'Rourke get to Rochester?
Well, I'm not really clear about that. My understanding is that his father was a tradesman, and there were large numbers of Irish immigrants who came to upstate New York with the advent of the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was the largest public works project ever undertaken in the United States, to build a 350-mile-long canal. They needed all kinds of laborers, they needed craftsmen, they needed carpenters, they needed masons. All of those trades were in great demand. And Rochester, which was an agricultural town because of its tradition as the flour city, as a mill town, the combination of those two brought large numbers of Irish immigrants here well before the American Civil War. So if I were a betting man, I would say that the O'Rourkes came here because of the construction of the canal.
And do you know what part of Rochester he grew up in?
Well, there was an Irish town up in the northeast part of the town, and my guess is that that's where he originally was in part of the Rochester community. There was also a large Irish community in the southwest side of the city down in the 19th Ward. But that was really where the O'Rourke family came from. I think they were from the northeast part of the city. Mm-hmm. And they came here in probably 1839, maybe 1840 is my guess.
I guess one of the things that's particularly interesting about O'Rourke, who of course did not live a long time, was how bright he was, how intelligent, and the fact that he ended up going to West Point.
Right. He was a graduate of the Rochester City Schools, and he was an acknowledged academic overachiever even when he was in the city school district. He graduated from the Rochester schools and then was offered a scholarship at the University of Rochester, which at the time was newly established. I think the U of R's roots trace back to about 1850. He would have been in one of the first 2 or 3 classes at the University of Rochester. But he wasn't able to take the scholarship because his father was killed in an industrial accident, was working while he was working. And so the young ORourke, who was only in his mid-teens, probably somewhere maybe 15, 16 years old, went to work to help support his family. And he originally started off as a mason, and that's how he got his initial start as a working man.
And how did he end up going to West Point?
Well, he was appointed. I mean, the process for the appointment at West Point has not really changed over the years. You needed a congressional appointment to get there, and he got that. I'm not sure who the congressman was in the Rochester region at the time, but he was appointed, and I think it was a smart bet. Given his academic prowess in high school, Patrick ORourke had success written all over him.
Yeah, and of course it's an amazing accomplishment in and of itself to get into West Point. But he certainly was an outstanding student there as well.
No question about it. He ended up finishing first in his class. He was the leader of his class, and it was the class of 1861 was actually a fascinating class because it's right at the start of the American Civil War. And so you had unusual character in it. George Armstrong Custer was in the class. But the other interesting thing about the class is that the war started in April of 1861, and the class hadn't finished its matriculation. They didn't matriculate until May. But prior to the start of the war, most of the cadets from the South just picked up and went to the South to join their states in the eventual fight against the Union. So the class was significantly shrunk because of the disappearance of the Southern cadets. And so, but nonetheless, even in the earlier years when they were all there, ORourke was still the leading student in the class. And then he graduates in 1861, and because the war has started, in fact, he fights at the first Battle of Bull Run, which is the initial battle in northern Virginia that commences the start of the war, the actual start of the fighting. ORourke is there in time to be a part of that. He's commissioned as a first lieutenant, and he's an engineer. He, as you know, oftentimes when those students go to West Point, they get a strong background in engineering, and ORourke had it. So he's right off as a first lieutenant as an engineer, and off he goes to war.
By the way, as a little side note, I know you're also very interested in George Armstrong Custer.
I am indeed. I'm a member of the Little Bighorn Association, which is the celebration of Custer. And Custer has a fascinating parallel to ORourke because Custer survives the Civil War and goes on, of course, to build his mythological career in the Indian Wars in the latter part of the 1860s and the 1870s until, of course, he meets his demise on the shores of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. But they were two sort of very interesting opposites. Custer finished last in the class, ORourke finished first. But they clearly knew each other and fought side by side in the early stages of the war.
And we'll talk in a moment about the Battle of Gettysburg, where, of course, they both fought.
Right.
So the war began, and ORourke then joined, was it the 140th New York?
Correct. He eventually ends up with the 140th. He fights at Bull Run. He fights at the Royal Plantation invasion, which is in the southern part of the Confederacy. He rejoins the Army. He's at Chancellorsville. I believe he's at Antietam. And it's eventually after the summer of 1862 that he actually comes home, marries his sweetheart in the summer and the early fall here in Rochester, and goes back to the fighting. And at that point is assigned to the 140th New York Regiment, which is mustered almost exclusively out of Rochester and Monroe County. And that's really the Rochester Regiment that fights in the remainder of the war.
And that's a fascinating perspective on the Civil War in general. How many of these regiments involve, lifelong friends,
right,
people who had grown up together.
Well, and as you know, Professor Madigan, at that time, going to war was what young men did. It was sort of understood that if you were between the ages of 16 and 24, you were going to be in the Army fighting in battle. And they raised huge number of troops at one point. The Union Army, both in the West and in the East, had as much as 500,000 men in it. So there were large numbers of people from all over the upstate region, and certainly Rochester, that joined the fight for the Union.
Well, this year we marked the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg from July 1st to 3rd, 1863, and that is where we're particularly commemorating O'Rourke for his heroism. I wonder if you could say just a little bit about the battle itself. I mean, I know
I would just,
thousands of books have been written
there
about
are thousands of books, and I would just suggest to anyone who has any interest in Patrick O'Rourke, read The Killer Angels, read any of the discussions of the fight at Gettysburg. I think it's important for people to understand O'Rourke's heroism, to understand what was at stake at Gettysburg. Lee had invaded Pennsylvania. It was the first time a Confederate army had been on Union soil. Lincoln is back in Washington, worried that he might get surrounded by the Confederate army. Lee has nobody's quite sure what he's going to do, whether he's going to march on Harrisburg, whether he's going to head up the state, up into the central portion of the state, whether he can live off the land, whether the Confederate army can forage off the land. George Gordon Meade, in charge of the Union Army, they really sort of trapped Lee into fighting at Gettysburg, where the Union Army has the superior position on the field. They hold the ridge at the end of the first day. They really are in the stronger military position. But the key to their military strength is on the extreme left flank of the Union Army. There are two small hills, Round Top and Little Round Top. Little Round Top is right at the left end of the Union Army. And that's where O'Rourke and the 140th Regiment are called into battle on the second day. But if you've ever been to the battle and stood on Little Round Top, you would understand that control of that hill is a pivot for the left flank of the Union Army and to preserve the strength of the Union line all the way down the ridge. And that's where O'Rourke gets the call.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. Anyone who has any interest in the Civil War should certainly visit Gettysburg, and if you do, and you go to Little Round Top, you'll really get a sense of what O'Rourke experienced.
Well, and I think the other thing, it's not too much of an overstatement to say that the entire future of the Union hinges on the Battle of Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. If you've seen the movie Lincoln and Daniel Day-Lewis's portrayal of Lincoln, you'll understand that there was a constant pressure on Lincoln to solve the Civil War problem by agreeing to a truce. And the question of whether Lee's invasion of the North could have led Pennsylvania to push Lincoln into a truce with the South becomes critically important, because Lincoln needs to show that he can prevent an invasion and that he can actually put a victory under the Union belt. There hadn't been many to that point. And so on the 4th of July weekend in 1863, I don't think you're overstating the case by saying the Union really hangs in the balance. Yeah. Because if Lee somehow wins that battle and is able to push the Union Army back, the pressure on Lincoln to end up in a truce becomes even stronger. And it's at that pivotal point on the second day that O'Rourke's heroism comes to the fore.
Well, and a related point, another aspect of pressure, is that Lincoln's great fear was that Great Britain and France would recognize the Confederacy as a bona fide country.
Correct.
And again, arguably, if the Confederates had won that battle, and Great Britain then said, we recognize this as a country, Lincoln's options would have been much less.
Well, and I think your point is well taken, and I think if you were alive in 1863, you weren't that far removed from 1783. When the French intervention of the French fleet at Yorktown forces the surrender of Cornwallis and actually gives birth to the American Republic. I think most people in America at that time realized that European intervention in the form of a fleet that could blockade New York or Boston or the Potomac River and provide the munitions for an army that did not have the large industrial strength of the North, if there had been an intervention at that point because of the Confederate victories, we might have a completely different country.
Yeah, and of course, there were a lot of people in Great Britain who wanted to continue the trade,
Right.
The cotton trade, and they wanted a truce.
Correct. And so there was, I think the point of all this is there was tremendous pressure in July of 1863 for the Union Army to show that it could repulse the Confederate invasion. And the key to that is to hold the left flank. And the left flank depends on controlling Little Round Top. There's an ongoing debate, Professor Madigan, about the significance of Little Round Top. There's a discussion and a suggestion in many of the historical reviews. The Little Round Top wasn't critical because it wasn't big enough to establish a fortified artillery base. So the question of whether had the Confederates been able to hold the hill, would they have been able to push the Union flank back? What I think is interesting about that argument is that on the morning of the third day, Meade himself goes to Little Round Top to survey the left flank. He's not sure where the Confederate attack is coming from, but he knows it's coming. Everybody knows it's coming. He can see that the Confederates are ready to storm. He can't figure out where. I think Meade's analysis was they wouldn't attack on the left flank because Little Round Top was such a difficult hill to conquer. And so at that point, Meade drew the conclusion the attack was going to come on the center, which is where Pickett's charge eventually comes, and the battle is really decided. But I think if you look at the geography of that left flank, had the Confederates held the hill, Meade has to retreat on the left side of the army, which might have changed the course of the battle and the course of history.
Well, I suppose there's many controversies with Gettysburg, but perhaps the greatest is about Dan Sickles. And if you can maybe speak briefly about him and how that led to the battle.
Sickles was a hero in his own mind well before he was a hero in the Union. He was, I think it's fair to say, an egotist. He had led the adventuresome efforts by the Union Army on the second day and the early stages of the battle in an attempt to push the Confederates back. But by doing so, at least in my judgment, had exposed large portions of the Union Army up on the hill. And there were serious questions about the wisdom of his actions during the course of the battle. I don't think anyone doubted his bravery. I think people doubted his intelligence and the wisdom of some of the choices that he made. But nonetheless, the bottom line is when we get to the middle of the second day, the Texas regulars from the Confederacy are storming up the front of Little Round Top. Patrick O'Rourke, the colonel in charge of the 140th Regiment, has been ordered to bolster the center portion of the Union line. So his troops are milling around behind the battle lines when General Warren steps forward and says, you go take that hill. Make sure they don't take that hill. The regiments from Maine, led by Joshua Chamberlain, another famous Civil War hero, and there are other regiments that are on the hill, but O'Rourke leads the 140th up the backside of the hill, realizes that in order to secure the hill, he has to drive the troops away from the base of the hill. He begins to lead the charge with a saber in his hand down the hill, and is shot through the throat and killed instantly. And he gets, it's not quite clear how far down the hill he got or what he did as he sounds the charge, but he's the first guy down the hill. And that's really the act of heroism that we seek to have recognized with the award of the Medal of Honor.
And I understand the idea to get a Congressional Medal of Honor is to show bravery in a sense above and beyond the call of duty, to really do something extraordinary. And there have been many who have argued that O'Rourke could have stood his ground. You mentioned General Warren, who I guess he knew from West Point, who ordered him to take the hill, but in so doing he would have to disobey previous orders.
Correct.
And he might well have been able to say, you know, you're not my general, as it were. I have to do what I was told.
Right.
And for prudence sake, he surely recognized the danger involved. And if he had stood his ground, as it were, he wouldn't have been, I guess, breaking any regulations.
Right. He could have easily said no. Yeah. He decided at that critical moment that that hill was that important that it had to be taken. And I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that many of the officers that were killed, and there were generals and certainly high-ranking officers who were killed in the slaughter at Gettysburg. But for the most part, they were mounted or they were slightly behind the lines. It would be unusual that the leader of the regiment is leading the troops down the hill on foot. And that's really what distinguishes, in my judgment, O'Rourke's heroism. He, as I've described this before, this is sort of my patented line, he comes to the United States to seek a new life, and he decides to give that new life up so that his new country could live. And I really think that's the best testament to O'Rourke's courage, is that he was willing to make that sacrifice when he's 26 years old and not even near the prime of his life. Sure. The other thing I think I should mention is, by seeking this medal for O'Rourke, we in no way diminish the bravery of thousands of men, both at Gettysburg and during the latter course of the war, and for that matter, the bravery on the other side as well. Mm-hmm. But we think that this is a time to say 150 years later that O'Rourke's heroism deserves to be recognized. As you know, we've talked about this before. The Medal of Honor was really in its infancy during the Battle of Gettysburg. The Congress had really just finally authorized the medal, and they were starting to award these medals. But they didn't award a lot of medals during the confusion of the Civil War because the slaughter was so broad. There were so many acts of heroism. There weren't a lot of medals. But what happened was the survivors, including Joshua Chamberlain, whose 20th Maine Regiment is next to the 140th, he gets the Medal of Honor 30 years later because he survived. He became the president of Bowdoin College, became the governor of Maine. He writes his autobiography, and of course, he's not shy about describing his acts of bravery, and we don't in any way diminish that. But we certainly think that Patrick O'Rourke, who didn't survive, doesn't get a fair shake from history because, in my judgment, a man who graduates first in his class at West Point, comes back to Rochester, New York as a general officer at the end of the war, he could have easily been the governor of this state. He could have been a United States senator. But I keep reminding everybody, he couldn't be president. He was born in Ireland. Got to be born in the United States.
Now, there was a mayor of Rochester who was a Civil War veteran who got the Medal of Honor.
There's a man, Dr. Richard Curran, gets the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he gets it under the same kinds of circumstances, from my point of view, that Joshua Chamberlain from Maine got it. He comes back to Rochester, settles in Rochester, becomes a political figure in the Republican Party, and is elected mayor of the city of Rochester. And he gets the Medal of Honor after he becomes mayor, because at that time they were still awarding medals for the work in the Civil War 30 or 40 years after the war was over. That's one of the reasons why we, who are campaigning for O'Rourke now, say, what's the difference between giving it 30 years after, 40 years after, or giving it 150 years later, when history has really passed a judgment on how brave and how heroic O'Rourke's actions were?
Well, the O'Rourke Memorial Committee has been around for about 20 years or so.
Correct.
And I know you've been very actively involved. In the Lavery Library here at Fisher, we have a painting donated by Bob and Ann Kelly, who were involved with starting the organization. And it shows O'Rourke leading the charge. And we just recently had a bust of O'Rourke brought to the library as well. And we at St. John Fisher are doing what we can to sort of keep alive the memory of this important man. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what else has been done to commemorate O'Rourke here in Rochester.
Well, the bridge over the Genesee River down at the mouth of the Genesee River used to be called the Stutson Street Bridge. When it was replaced, the bridge was dedicated to O'Rourke, and so it's now called the O'Rourke Bridge. The other thing that we're trying to do, Professor, is get people to sign a petition. We hope we can put it up on the screen for the O'Rourke Memorial Society. Go on the web, sign the petition. This is part of what we're going to do when we submit the application for the award of the medal to O'Rourke. But I just want to commend Fisher, the Irish Studies program. This college, and I think through your leadership, has really done a very good job of connecting the Rochester Irish community and its various efforts to the academic questions of Irish culture and Irish history. For those of us who are Irish, even though my surname is Dollinger, I come from a Finnegan, Bassett, Moran family. For those of us who are Irish, the preservation of Irish culture and understanding of Ireland's contributions to this country, I think is vitally important, and I commend Fisher, through your leadership, President Bain, and others who have made this effort work. It's important.
Well, I have to say, I've been to Gettysburg. I'm from Buffalo originally, and I've been to Gettysburg several times in the past, and sadly, I wasn't aware of how important O'Rourke was. But when I moved here and learned about the committee, next time I went to Gettysburg, it was quite evident how important he is. There is a bus to him there and to the 140th on Little Round Town.
Well, that's one of the things I would suggest for the students here at Fisher. Go to the library, look at a portrait, the picture, the painting of O'Rourke as he's about to launch down the hills. That painting is an indication moments before he dies. And then the bust is located there as well. But it's not the most famous O'Rourke nose in the business. If you get to Gettysburg and get to Little Round Top on this, the 150th anniversary of the battle, go look at the top of Little Round Top for the shiniest nose you can find. It is good luck for every Irishman, and quite frankly, non-Irishman, if you rub O'Rourke's nose. And there is a bronze statue, a bas-relief statue, a bust of O'Rourke. And the thing that you'll see is he has the brightest, shiniest brass nose anywhere in Gettysburg. And it's always good luck. You can kiss the Blarney Stone if you're in Ireland, but if you rub O'Rourke's nose, you'll be just as lucky.
Well, I did rub the nose, and I hope that will be good luck for us getting him the Congressional Medal of Honor.
That's
I was thinking of that as I did so. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the burial of O'Rourke and where he is buried.
Well, he's originally buried at Gettysburg right off the bat. They had to basically get control of the bodies. There was such carnage in the battlefield. He's buried there briefly. He's brought back here to Rochester, and he's buried on Pinnacle Hill, which was a city cemetery on the Brighton city of Rochester town line. But the body is eventually moved again to Holy Sepulchre, and they give him a Catholic funeral. He was a Catholic. He had married when on his leave. He married his high school sweetheart. Upon his death, she eventually became a Sacred Heart nun and was a distinguished teacher through the rest of her life. But they have a big funeral cortege for O'Rourke because he's the most celebrated Irishman from Rochester. And the interesting thing about it is, Professor, my Irish roots in this community go back to 1860. My great-great-grandfather, Edward Hanna, lived in the city at the time, and so did my great-great-grandfather, William Bassett. And I'm convinced, and one of the reasons why this is personal to me, is I'm absolutely convinced that both of my great-great-grandfathers knew the O'Rourke family and were probably present at his funeral. He has a funeral cortege that goes to Holy Sepulchre, where he's buried. And the interesting thing about it is it violates the rules of the Diocese of Buffalo. At that time, Rochester was not a separate diocese. But it violates the rules of the Diocese of Buffalo because the Diocese of Buffalo said you could never have any more than 4 carriages in a funeral procession. Well, when O'Rourke is buried, there are 120. And the priest who presides at the grave is disciplined by the diocese for violating the rules. But in this tremendous outpouring of the newly settled Irish community in Rochester, the wake and the burial of Patrick O'Rourke are really huge memories and huge parts of the early Irish community right here in Rochester.
Well, we will have an event on the 150th anniversary, July 2nd, and you and I will be there. And
we will.
Hopefully the Catholic priest who is with us will not be disciplined for this. So
we hope to have it down at Holy Sepulchre at his cemetery. We'll bring in some of the reenactors, I hope, from the 140th. We'll recruit parts of the Irish community, and it'll be a great celebration. It'll be the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. It'll be the 4th of July weekend, the 4th of July holiday, and of course, Rochester's favorite Irish son will celebrate his life as well.
Well, thank you, Judge Dollinger, and we hope to see you there on July 2nd, and please sign the petition.
Please do.